everyone, and welcome to another Scots Way podcast. And today I'm delighted to be joined once again by Graeme Macrae Burnet. Hello, Graeme.
Hello, Alistair. Lovely to be here again.
And we're here to talk about your latest novel, Case Study. So, how do you describe Case Study when folk like me ask you about it?
Well, I'm just kind of learning to describe it, Alistair, because, the book comes out next week, so I haven't really got my elevator pitch, honed yet. But what I say when somebody asks me what it's about is that it's a novel about a young woman in 1965 in London who believes that a radical psychotherapist called Collins Braithwaite, a quite monstrous character who I'm sure we'll talk more about.
Absolutely.
She believes that he has driven her sister Veronica to suicide, and in order to sort of investigate this, she does what any normal person would do under the circumstances and presents herself as a client to Collins Braithwaite, using an assumed name to disguise her identity. So from that premise, kind of the narrative of the book unfolds. The book is told mainly in the form of 5 notebooks written by this young woman, which have very fortunately been sent to me.
Yes.
And interspersed with those 5 notebooks is kind of biographical material about Collins Braithwaite, which I've written. So the book alternates between these 2 sections, but it's mainly the notebooks of the young women.
There are other texts in there, and we might talk a bit about those as well. But it does start out with you getting these notebooks. You visit, Voltaire and Rousseau, and you discover Collins Braithwaite's book, and there's a lot of different sources throughout, as well as these notebooks.
Yeah, I suppose the main source, perhaps you're mentioning, is that within the first of the notebooks we then have a chapter of Collins Braithwaite's own book, which was called Untherapy, and this was a book that Collins Braithwaite wrote in the mid-60s, a book of case studies, and my character has read Collins Braithwaite's book and believes that one of the cases in question is her sister Veronica, under the disguised as Dorothy, in Braithwaite's own account of this series of psychotherapeutic sessions. There are other texts, and I don't know if there's obviously my own introduction to how the notebooks were sent to me, which perhaps has something in common with my previous novel, His Bloody Project.
So before we go into the details of the characters, why did you want to write this book? Where did the kind of initial idea come from?
I think the initial idea for the book came from, quite a long period off and on of reading psychiatric case studies. There's a book just behind you called The 50-Minute Hour, and this was a 1950s or 60s absolute bestseller,
right?
Written by a psychoanalyst at the time called Robert Lindner, and it sold millions of copies. And I came across that book when I was probably a teenager or in my early 20s.
Right.
And, there's a fascination with that kind of material. It's presented quite salaciously, murderers, sadists, and, there's a voyeuristic pleasure in reading this kind of material about people who suffer from, quite severe mental disturbances. And, these case studies tend to be chosen because they are unusual.
Yeah.
They're not sort of everyday sort of anxiety or depression. But as I read more case studies over the years, I became more and more suspicious of the nature of the presentation of this material. That rather than seeing it as being neutrally presented as being objective, or even as some psychiatrists or psychoanalysts would present the material as scientific. I began to think of these encounters, or the accounts of these encounters, as being, for one thing, extremely subjective. We only get the account of the therapist, and the therapist selects the material that he or she thinks is relevant, and then they interpret the material In some cases, they even augment the material. In Freud's famous case, Dora, he actually is rather dismissive of the account of the traumatic event in question that Dora, his client, has given him, and adds details to it which he's completely open about.
Yeah.
And then uses those details which he has invented as the basis for his analysis. I mean, it's mind-blowingly shocking. So I suddenly saw that these encounters were not being presented just as facts, and I became more and more curious about how would they appear if these accounts had been written by the person on the other side of the room, i.e. the client or the patient. And so I kind of sought out where I could accounts written by patients. The most notable of those is perhaps R.D. Laing is a character. We may talk more about R.D. Laing later. But R.D. Laing's most famous patient was a woman called Mary Barnes, and she wrote an account of her experiences in Kingsley Hall, which was R.D. Laing's therapeutic community. And so that's absolute gold dust, because this was the direction that I really wanted to of research at this point. I wanted to find this kind of material. And there's another book called The Inner World of Mental Illness, which is mentioned in a footnote in one of R.D. Laing's books. And the wonderful thing about the internet is you can actually go and find those really obscure texts. So I was very interested, especially reading accounts from the sort of 50s and 60s, which is when the book's set. So it was really the origin, the genesis of the book was really in becoming more and more fascinated in the dynamics of that relationship. So not reading case studies as sort of scientific documents, but reading them in a much more novelistic kind of ways, like an encounter between two people, and deconstructing the idea that the therapist is more sane than the client, which when you read some of Freud's stuff, you really start to question.
But in a way, it's the telling of the same story from two different points of view.
Absolutely.
And it's because when I read the book, I thought, there's a lot of research going in there, but I didn't think that was the direction it was going. So how difficult was it to find such accounts of patient-written?
Well, I mean, it's one of these things. Once you start looking, you can't find them, and there's not. I think it's probably much more commonplace nowadays for people who've been in therapy to write about their therapeutic experience. I suppose I was more interested in historical accounts, mid-20th century accounts, as I say, and they're probably fewer and further between. But even a couple of, the Wolfman, the so-called Wolfman, which was another Freud's client's patient, he wrote a 300-page account of his own life, which is, of course, fascinating. The most fascinating thing about it is that Freud bases his entire analysis of the Wolfman, who's actually a Russian aristocrat called Sergei Pankev.
Right.
Freud bases his analysis of this little boy, as he was at the time, on a single dream that Pankev had of some wolves or dogs in a tree outside his window. And this event is of such great importance to Sergei Pankev that in the 300 pages he never mentions it. So that's fascinating to me. But this is what I mean about the selection of material as being important. Probably it was important to this 8-year-old boy, I think he was at the time, but he becomes branded as the Wolfman, a very dehumanizing label. I always imagined before I read the Wolfman that he was somebody who was maybe barked at the moon and went out in a lycanthropic way. Is that the word?
I think it is.
I never managed to use that in a sentence before. It's just it's really fascinating to read. What was it like to be in the room with Freud? What was it like to be in the room with R.D. Laing?
I guess that's true. I hadn't thought about that either. In that, yes, it's the same story being told two different ways, but it's also for once, the patient reflecting on their doctor, which is a rare thing to read about as well.
Absolutely. I mean, Laing was not really so heavily involved in Mary Barnes' therapy, but she was living in this community that he'd founded. So when he came in, he was clearly the sort of very charismatic figure. Very, people would go, "Oh, Ronnie's in," and he was a very, very prominent figure in the sort of counterculture of the time. Celebrities visited him. Famously Sean Connery came to Kingsley Hall,
right,
and R.D. Laing challenged him to a wrestling match. So it's a typical Glaswegian response to James Bond coming around. It's like, I'll wrestle you, pal. I don't know if they actually wrestled. I need to check that out. But I mean, what a great image, And I think Laing tried to persuade Sean Connery to take some LSD with him, but Connery apparently declined.
I mean, that was the thing about that time as well, was you psychiatry, psychotherapy, but there was also the counterculture of drugs beginning to come in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the LSD thing, one of the reasons I think that Laing has been kind of decried retrospectively, partly because some of his later work is quite odd, and he did go down some weird directions. But I think people hear the letters LSD and they kind of clutch their pearls. If LSD was known by its proper name, which I can't off the top of my head, lysergic acid or
something like that.
People go, "Oh, I don't know what that is." It's just a drug, and it may have therapeutic value. And from what I've read of R.D. Laing's use of LSD with his clients, was that he used it in a very professional medical way.
Yeah.
He wasn't tripping. He wasn't going tripping with his clients. And Laing was trying to find ways to treat clients which did not include putting electricity in their heads.
Yeah.
To use a phrase that he uses.
Yeah.
And so to use a drug which we now have, generally speaking, have negative associations with, was not necessarily as outrageous as it now seems, and because we liked, so the whole thing of like the mixture of the counterculture and the drug scene and psychotherapy, it's true, but I think Laing's use of LSD was perhaps not as scandalous as people might assume, just because of these confluence of those two things.
Yeah, because I think often the connotations that he had is put in with a lot of writers and poets and other people who it was very much a kind of opening the senses of whatever it might be.
The Ginsbergs and the Burroughs and the what's the Timothy Leary and stuff. I think probably he did encounter these people.
And Trocky as well, wasn't he?
Trocky. He liked a bit of heroin, didn't he?
He did.
Yeah,
he did.
But
so for those who don't know, I think we're quite good, because R.D. Laing does kind of cast a shadow, and he does appear in the book, at least mentioned in the book over it. So he was this really well-known character. So what was his book? The Divided Self was his kind of bestseller, if you like, that. So what kind of interested you about him as a character and with his work?
Well, I mean, I read The Divided Self in preparation for writing the book quite deliberately, and I found it to be. I mean, I think I'd owned a copy since I was a student. I don't know if I'd ever actually read it or finished it, but in reading it now as a man of 50 years old or whatever, I found it to be a really stunning and electrifying piece of work. It's a book. I don't read books on psychology or psychiatry because I'm interested in theories of theoretical positions on mental illness or whatever. I read them because I want to recognise something about myself or understand something about myself. So when I read The Divided Self, that is a book that absolutely speaks to me. And it speaks to ways in which I've behaved over the years. I relate to some of the key concepts in the book the two key concepts for me are, he talks about a system or people who are in difficulty living a kind of system of false selves, and these false selves perhaps taking over from the true self. This is a contradiction or a question that is kind of examined a little bit in my book. But, and this idea of false selves is, to me, only an idea that we behave in different ways depending on the context in which we're in. So here I am talking to you as a writer, and I present myself in a certain way. I'm going out for dinner with my parents later. I won't speak in the same way to them, because it's a different kind of conversation. But I think when you're younger, you behave differently when you're with your pals at school as you do when you're at home. And, so when these two personas come into conflict, you sometimes you don't know how to behave, and that can be quite problematic, And I think for some people, maybe those different personas become more exaggerated, and then when they come into contact, it becomes more and more problematic. Or the persona becomes the person, So all that kind of stuff, I really relate to that. And when I was reading The Divided Self, I was reflecting on my first novel, The Disappearance of Adele Badeau, and I felt like the main character in that book, Manfred Baumann, if I had set out to write a character based on what R.D. Laing describes in The Divided Self, it would have been Manfred Baumann. He conforms to all the sort of key concepts. The other key concept for me in The Divided Self is the idea of a sort of feeling of hyper self-consciousness, where you believe that your every act and most minute pieces of behaviour is being analysed by everybody around you, being noticed, and this causes you almost to just seize up as a person, because the pressure on how to behave is
exhausting.
It's absolutely exhausting. And again, this is Manfred Baumann absolutely overthinking his every action. When he changes his lunch order, he thinks everyone in the kitchen is going to be like running around going, "Oh my God, Manfred Baumann changed his order," but of course nobody's paying any attention. So these are things that I sort of relate to, and I think the character, the protagonist in Case Study, also exhibits some of these behaviours, especially these ideas about the false selves. Everybody almost in the book kind of has two different kind of personas, which are more or less, to some extent, in conflict, or one is an exaggeration of the other. So Laing's writing, actually, I really, really rate, or at least the early work. I also he totally deconstructs the idea that the therapist is more sane than the client, and he treated what he would call people's delusions as having a truth for the client themselves, and not just to be dismissed. So he tried to engage in a therapeutic way rather than just diagnose, and I think that's very exciting and very modern. And I'm in a way surprised that it doesn't have a more prominent position in the sort of history of moving towards different modes of counselling that we might see today. Not that I'm in any way an expert in that. So he looms very large over the book.
And you do wonder, and this kind of ties in with your character of Collins Braithwaite, you do wonder if the reason that his influence isn't perhaps as great today is because his fame, or even kind of infamy, is perhaps a better way of putting it, became so great.
No, I think that for me there's no question that that's the case with Laing. There was the sort of dabbling with LSD, and he was later in the early 70s, I think, arrested for possession of LSD. LSD was not illegal in the 60s, but he was, I think, arrested but not charged for supplying. But he started to get into a lot of sort of rebirthing stuff, and what we might think of as much more new age kind of hippie stuff, which personally it doesn't interest me. And he had a massive alcohol problem, and I think he, in his latter part of his career, he often perhaps was not functioning at his best.
Yeah.
I mean, we've all been guilty of that, it's okay if you're a writer, but I think his reputation suffered because of those things.
Yeah. So we've got let's go to the two central characters then. You've got the psychiatrist Collins Braithwaite, who got this idea of creating the self that you're talking about, and he definitely seems to create his own mythology as he goes through.
So Collins Braithwaite is born Arthur Collins Braithwaite, and he comes from Darlington. His father was an ironmonger. He was born in 1925, and his father is a very sort of bluff Northern English working man who's done well. And Collins Braithwaite, or Arthur Braithwaite, rebels very much against him. He's a bright boy who gets a scholarship to Oxford, in common with quite a lot of the characters of that era in British culture. The beginnings of the angry young men who are very often grammar school educated and got scholarships to prestigious universities. So Collins Braithwaite goes off to Oxford to study philosophy, very possibly only because this is the thing that would most annoy his father, who's a bluff County Durham man, he later studies psychology and gets a PhD and becomes a psychotherapist, sort of semi-accidentally. Where are we going with this?
Well, I just want to know about the character himself, because he creates his own character. Because you say he starts out as Arthur from the north.
Yes.
He embraces aspects of that.
Yes.
There's no doubt about it, but he also kind of changes things around.
He reinvents himself as Collins Braithwaite, and Collins Braithwaite is almost self-consciously a character that he creates, and it allows him to sort of shed some of his sort of northern bluffness and take part in this London scene. He writes a book which is almost a sort of direct riposte to Lang's Divided Self, in which he criticises Lang, and through an encounter with Dirk Bogarts, finds himself becoming a sort of therapist to actors and theatre people and celebrities, and he is he takes on the mantle of being more radical than Lang. So Lang, of course, hates him because he's stolen his thunder as the enfant terrible of psychotherapy in London in the 60s. And there's walk-on parts for quite a few characters of the era. But I like to mesh the character into the sort of real, onto a canvas that we know already exists. And I think that creates a sort of reality to what's going on.
Oh, it absolutely does. And you spoke about it being in the 50s and 60s and the angry young men. You do mention Look Back in Anger, and you do mention Colin Wilson's book, which name is
The Outsiders.
The Outsiders. Is that a time that really fascinates you?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's I think that period in post-war British culture was tremendously exciting, and we talk about the angry young men, and they were, aside from Sheila Delaney, men, but there was a kind of overthrowing of the old guard, which I think is quite genuine. That these were not Eton, Harrow educated young men. They were from the north of England. They were sometimes Colin Wilson, and tremendously self-regarding and eccentric character, but he was entirely self-educated. He hadn't been to university. He allegedly wrote this book, The Outsiders, while sleeping rough in Hampstead Heath. I suspect there's a bit of mythology around that, but there was a week in 1956 when this book, which took the sort of literary world of London by storm, came out in the same week as John Osborne's play Look Back in Anger was premiered. So, and that's when the term angry young men was coined. There are different versions of who coined the term, but apparently it was the Daily Express. If you believe that, I can't say, but so that time was fascinating. Then it moves into the 60s, and I think the 60s, there's nothing original to say that the 60s was an exciting period in British filmmaking and British writing. But what in a way interested me was that, I think it's important to recognise that the 60s was swinging for a very small number of people. The vast majority of people, even in London, still lived lives of post-war austerity, and social attitudes were still not as progressive as they would have been for this sort of cultural elite, for want of a better word. And my character, the protagonist of the book, the young woman, she is a woman of the 50s.
Yeah, very much so.
And she is sexually repressed and is in no way sort of has the social attitudes that we associate with the time. And so she comes into contact with the world of Collins Braithwaite. Maybe I suppose I find that amusing.
Well, because you talk about mythology there, and he does create this mythology, and also he's clearly a charismatic person, but yet a pretty terrible person as well, particularly a lot of his dealings with women.
He's a monster.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm glad you said that.
There's a section in the book where it deals with his time at Oxford University when he's a little bit older than most of the students, and he's lived in France and stuff, and he's much more worldly, and he is absolutely charismatic, and he has his acolytes, and he uses his power over people in a pretty unpleasant way. I mean, there are a couple of little stories about him in the book, which I'm like, that is, this is not a guy you want to hang out with at all, as you say, particularly in his dealings with women. He's a monster, and it's quite exciting writing that kind of character.
Is it exciting? Is it surprising writing a character like that?
There are a couple of things that I wrote. I was like, can I write this? It's so unpleasant. He's behaving so unpleasantly. But it's also interesting when the book's been read by people of an age who have lived through that, and they recognise those behaviours. And both from men and from women. And obviously I'm somebody who likes to do my research as well, aside from the sort of research we were talking about before about sort of the psychiatric or psychotherapeutic relationships. I like to read sort of social history of the time, and hopefully what I describe in the way Collins Braithwaite behaves is got some basis in the general behaviour of men at the time.
And to go down to what you were saying about the young woman, you're absolutely right, because she still lives at home with her father, and it's very much is trying to fit into the role that she believes she has to fit into, and then that. I don't want to spoil anything, but
well, I think she's not unaware that she is supposed to want to be a young independent woman. This is the phrase that comes up, and that's a phrase I got from reading women's magazines at the time. But she's terrified of independence. She doesn't want to be independent. She wants to stay at home and look after her daddy because it's safe. But that's her defense mechanism, I would say, from her own insecurities and her fears about the world. And she does get a job, and she works as a receptionist in a theatrical agency. Which I don't know why I'm laughing at.
Well, I do, because it's excellent. Seems this idea of taking clearly, at least to begin with, this innocent woman and sticking her in the middle of Soho at that time or something.
But it's not raunchy in that way. But it was like one of these things, that when as you're writing, or as I'm writing, I just write and like, all right, she's going to apply. She needs to get a job, So, and then she gets a job, and then for no reason, no conscious reason, she gets a job at a theatrical agency. And of course, I realised later that this kind of chimes with that she's dealing constantly with people who are presenting themselves in a way that is other to themselves.
Yeah.
And so there's all these little synergies, I suppose, that come in when you're writing. I suppose they just reflect your own preoccupations to some extent, but I love it when a sort of coincidence like that turns up. But yeah, she's she is sort of in conflict with the expectations that were beginning to arise from the early 60s for women to become more independent and to aspire to be more than just the sort of accessory to their husband.
And for her, when worlds collide, that's not exactly what you say, but when the different selves, if you like, that need to be created, at least she believes so, collide, then that's when things start to be complicated for her.
Yeah, when she goes to see Collins Braithwaite for the first time, she realises she can't be herself because she would immediately, Collins Braithwaite would immediately know that she's the sister of his previous client, Veronica. So she creates this persona for herself called Rebecca Smith.
With a Y.
With a Y. Smith with a Y, of course. And Rebecca is, to some extent, everything that she's not. She's kind of self-confident, and she's somehow better looking.
Yeah.
The very, and it's not given too much away. The first time she's going to see Collins Braithwaite, she asks a young man for directions to his office, and they fall into step. And she's sort of trying out her new persona. So Rebecca, of course, is much more flirtatious than she would ever be, and she says to herself, it was quite a lark being Rebecca. And so there's an enjoyment. She begins to have this enjoyment of being this other character, and it affords her some freedoms that she wouldn't feel herself. And I think that, maybe you're alluding to, leads to some sort of conflict between herself and the character of Rebecca Smith, and who she prefers to be.
Yeah.
And of course, once she sets up, the Rebecca Smith character with this guy Tom, or whatever his name is, she can't say, oh, actually, I'm not really Rebecca Smith. She has to keep it up. And I think sometimes, people have, that's a situation that you could find yourself in real life.
Oh, and I know people who have done, not giving away any names.
Well, you could, in a sort of simple level, like be at a party and somebody's talking about Finnegan's Wake, and you don't admit that you haven't read it.
Yeah.
And then later on, you're in the same conversation, you have to keep up the idea that you're somebody who read Finnegan's Wake. And I can imagine that with my sort of overthinking novelist brain becoming the plot of a whole novel.
You see this through to the bitter.
Yeah, I say that as a person who's never read Finnegan's Wake. So yeah, sometimes we find ourselves caught in a lie.
Yes.
And again that goes back to Manfred Baumann. He lies about something, and then he has to keep up the story that he's in. And he's a character who it's actually created a persona for himself, and it's crippled him. So it's funny looking back over other things you've written and seeing the relevance of a little sort of thread of ideas going through different things you've written which you felt were unconnected.
It was something which I thought of when I was reading it, and is that you've written these two George Gorski novels, and you've written these two standalone novels, and I'm a big fan of Ian M. in brackets Banks, who did his fiction and his sci-fi was split in that way. But it sounds as though you don't see that kind of definition. It's simply a case of you writing whatever you want to write at the time. And actually there are, like Banks as well, there are threads and there are things that run through both.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I absolutely just want to write whatever I want. I wouldn't want to create a discrete persona for the Gorsky books, which are, they are crime novels.
Yeah.
Maybe not wholly conventional crime novels, but no, I see a continuum between all of that stuff, even although they are superficially different. I mean, His Bloody Project is superficially incredibly different from Case Study, but structurally and in terms of the way the material is presented, there's some very striking similarities.
Yeah.
And equally, my character in this book, my protagonist, I see her as being very similar to Manfred Baumann and The Spoons of Adele Wadeau, and all my books feature sort of episodes of sort of teenage angst. There's an episode in this book where Rebecca Smith, we could say, relates a story of her own sort of teenage years and sort of early sexual fumbling experience. And that seems to crop up quite a lot. So it's just funny the things you find yourself returning to.
Yeah, because I think in all your books there's always someone who is struggling, maybe in fact almost every character, but is struggling with who they are and have a crisis of self at some point.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's just what all characters in novels do.
Yeah, maybe they do.
But yeah, I mean, I think there's the common thread, maybe, making yourself appear to be someone other than you actually are. And that can, as a response to feeling that you don't fit into the world very comfortably. So if you don't fit in comfortably, it can be more comfortable to be somebody else. So my character, she has a lot more fun being Rebecca Smith than she does being herself.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's quite interesting. Thank you, Doctor Braidwood.
You should be lying prone for this session. Well, let's talk about the structure of the book, because it's interesting. You do have the notebooks, as you say, which is the centrepiece, but you have a chapter from Braithwaite's book. You have your own introduction and inspection at the end as well. And now I've asked you this before and you've said, well, you're not deliberately playing with readers. I have to say, I think readers enjoy being played with. They enjoy that kind of thing. But there is you must realise there's an aspect of that. The one that caught me this time was when you say 2 note pages of the notebook are missing in the middle of it. But is that just something that you're looking at a different way of telling a story?
I honestly wouldn't say I'm looking at a different way of telling a story, because this is how novels have been written since the 19th century. I mean, I would never strive for originality for its own sake. I think that's a very sort of superficial aspiration. All I'm doing is using the means available to a novelist to tell the story. And there's nothing in any of my books you won't find in Robert Louis Stevenson or James Hogg or Wilkie Collins. So with the notebooks, I mean, I think I felt that as describing earlier, these accounts that I was reading of sort of therapeutic relationships, my character had to be writing down her experiences, and she begins by saying, I've decided to write down everything that happens, just as Roddy McRae begins by saying he has been asked to write down an account by his advocate, Mr. Sinclair. So they're both self-consciously narrating their own stories. I don't know why that appeals to me, other than the fact that I don't want to just be inside the head of a character. I'm always like, how do we as a reader get how do we have access to this material? So even once I've decided that there's going to be 5 notebooks, I'm then like, well, if I was reading this, I'd be like, well, how did you get hold of these notebooks? So then I have to have an explanation of that.
Right.
So it kind of worked that way around. Did I find them in a skip? Like as a recent notebook. I don't even know if that is the book where some notebooks were found in a skip. I don't even know if that's real or.
That reminds me of the Hitler diaries, which proved to be a fake.
That was actually a novel I wrote. It's just I want to tell the story in what seems like the most appropriate way, and I think I really like to mix different accounts of the same events, which is not so much what I'm doing here, but what I wanted was as we read through the book and we have the contemporaneous notebooks of the young women, but we learn more about Collins Braithwaite as we go through the book, and as you've alluded, we learn that Collins Braithwaite is pretty sort of monstrous. Whether dangerous we don't know, but we know more about Collins Braithwaite than our protagonist does. So I think that when she sort of continues to go back to see him, we might feel differently about those encounters than just what she's describing to us. And also, I describe Collins Braithwaite's life, but I also describe, what he wrote about, and so to some extent, I would hope that kind of meshes with the experiences that she's having, and there's a kind of sort of syncopated sort of thing going on there, where the two strands of the novel connect to each other and make you reflect differently than if you had merely read the notebooks.
It goes back to that idea I spoke about at the beginning about storytelling, and you're almost getting the third version of the story, aren't you? Which is ours projecting what we think about. Well,
that's the most important bit. What the reader thinks. But in terms of the whole sort of playing with the reader, I know that this is something I get sort of accused
and it's not an accusation.
I know, but people actually don't believe me that I'm not deliberately doing it.
I do believe that you're not deliberately doing it, but I just think it's maybe almost it's the expectations of the reader. Almost they maybe expect that there's going to be some slight of.
I remember being in Bloody Scotland a few years ago, and I was listening to a writer discussing how he constructed his plots, and I'm not telling this story in order to denigrate this way of writing, but he said, I try to imagine what the reader will think at any point, and then I'd go in the opposite direction. So that's the way he works, and that is absolutely fine. For me, it's horrifying because it feels to me completely inauthentic. Because I only will follow where I don't know what's going to happen. When in the first notebook, Rebecca Smith, I'm making air quotes goes off, meets this young man. That begins with her asking directions. Everything that ensues from that, I had no idea would happen. So I'm just following, and then so something happens, and then because of that, something else happens. And people quite often, when they're reading the drafts and stuff, they say very often to me, I've no idea where you're going with this, Graeme. And the reason I think, it's not necessarily a compliment, but it's because I don't know where I'm going, and so I'm never manipulatively playing with the reader. I'm going where it takes me, and the strand of the story relating, the life of Collins Braithwaite, I had absolutely no idea how that would end up, and it came as some sort of surprise to me that it ends up the way it does. But it's really deeply satisfying to me.
Is that why you do reference, real people in the books, or particularly in this book? It kind of keeps it in a reality, they said, well, was there a Collins Braithwaite? Did he know R.D. Laing? These kind of questions that come up.
That is, I think, that is, well, the thing is, if Collins Braithwaite had existed, he would have encountered those people, and he would have gone to the Roundhouse, so that famous event in 1967 where Allen Ginsberg read Howl, and everybody who would Monica Vitti was there, and Collins Braithwaite would have been there. Collins Braithwaite, would have been drinking in bars in Soho, and would have met these kind of characters, because he's a very bold character. He would go up and talk to people. He would expect them to come up and talk to him. Actually, he's an absolute alpha male beast. Terrifying. But yeah, as I say, I think meshing my character into the canvas that we already know from that period of history, it's a bit like Woody Allen's film Zelig, where Zelig turns up in all these sort of tableaus from history, it's again, I don't think there's anything particularly unusual about having real people having a walk-on part. I don't know, you probably read a lot more novels than me.
I'm trying to think. It's not. I guess it happens in some and it doesn't in others. But I just think there's a kind of blurring of lines somewhere, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a total blurring of lines, and I think it also goes because when I write about Collins Braithwaite, I write about him in the style of a literary journalism or literary biography, and when you use that kind of style, it signifies to the reader that what you're writing about is true in a way that writing in a novelistic style doesn't. So you're using those techniques to create an illusion of reality, just as a documentary. If a filmmaker uses a shaky camera, it signifies reality. And in a way, the sort of literary journalistic style I use, or say using the occasional footnote, signifies the existence of these events outside the text. That's I think people will Google Collins Braithwaite.
Yeah, I'm sure of it.
You mean you didn't?
Yes, I did.
It's when I did book groups and stuff for His Bloody Project, almost always the first question I was asked was did this really happen?
Yeah. I think I must be getting used to your writing now, because I didn't Google Collins Braithwaite, but what I did do, because you mentioned a Kierkegaard book briefly, and that took me back to studying philosophy, and I went, I've read that.
Right.
That's written. He wrote that with a pseudonym. I'm fairly sure he
did. Did he really? Yeah. Oh my God! If only I'd known that. That's so cool. And
I was sure you would have known that, and that's why. So I was giving it bigger meaning than
right. Well, that's fascinating. Do you know why?
No, I'd have to check it out.
Because Soren Kierkegaard is such a cool name.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be cool if we found out that wasn't his real name and the other name was actually the real one?
Yeah, I'm now dating myself. I'm going to have to check that out, but I'm fairly sure that was the case. Yeah. And I was thinking, this must lead into, the author.
Well, and it's a book about the self.
Yes, well, it is, yeah. And that's what the Kierkegaard book is about, which I can see why it was mentioned. But then I was looking for deeper meaning. That's what you do.
Yeah, but the thing is that the deeper meaning is neither there nor not there.
Yes.
It's a matter of the interpretation of the reader. And so most people haven't read Kierkegaard. And I've read very little Kierkegaard. You having read more Kierkegaard, latch onto that and create meanings out of your relationship with the text. That meaning is therefore exists. It's not that it's not valid because it's not what I intended.
You're absolutely
and
right.
that is this goes to the heart for me of why I like to create these texts in which there is space for the reader, and that is very often, or one way of doing that I think is by having different accounts of the same thing, or accounts in which some doubt begins to exist about whether what you're being told is true, or even if you agree with the version of events you've been given. And I do, you when you do author events, which is a kind of contradiction for me, because I am an advocate of the death of the author,
Yes, I know.
And but the death of the author is the liberation of the reader.
Yeah.
And the reader's right to interpret the text as they see fit, and for that interpretation to be valid. It doesn't need to be validated by being tested against the intentions of the author.
Yeah.
You know.
But it is interesting, I think, because perhaps as much as at any time, the kind of, not the cult of the author, that's taking it too far, but you're doing events and and people are asking you questions and often probably expecting answers where sometimes I think you would rather go, well, it's in the book.
Well, no, but I do get asked for the answers, and I never answer. I mean, and I know I know you're going to be frustrated, but the material is here. The material in His Bloody Project is here. We can have a conversation about what we both think, but my opinion as the author is of no more validity than yours, as long as we're both referencing stuff that's there. And I don't even think it's I mean, this idea's been around since the 1960s.
Yeah, no,
it's not, but it seems, and I think with the whole literary festival circuit and stuff, whatnot, you say the cult of the author. I mean, in Bart's article, he talks about the cult of the author and how it's it anchors the text, it enchains the text. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. But until even when I was a student back in the 1980s, there wasn't this proliferation of author events and book festivals. There was very few book festivals. I don't even think people had book launches. Yeah. I thought I would sometimes go to a poetry reading in the Third Eye Centre. We were probably at some of the same ones. But nowadays, as an author, you're expected to also have a public persona and to take part in these events. Luckily for me, I'm a big show off, and I really like doing. I genuinely like. I love when we get to the point of an event where we take questions from the audience. It's like I find it very engaging, and I did the first event for this book just at the weekend, and it was so great to be back with an audience. But you can do it without, and you can talk about the book without, anchoring the meaning. And I always refuse to provide answers which aren't in the text. I mean, with my first book, I think all of my books are somewhat inconclusive in their endings, deliberately so. And particularly the Disappearance of Adele Badeau, there's a sort of big question that looms over the end of the book, and then people ask me, so what actually happened there? I'm like, I don't know. What do you think happened? And I think most people want to punch me at that point. But it's very important. But and also even in a sort of kind of self-interested way, I think if you conclude everything very neatly, tie up all the loose ends, then I think the person puts a book down and it's kind of dead.
Yeah.
Whereas if there are still open questions, then I think the book can linger longer in people's minds. And I think with His Bloody Project, and I love book groups, I think the reason that the book was quite successful within book groups because it is open to different interpretations, so people can actually have a conversation about it, and they can actually have very divergent views about the same characters in the book, but still without, but still based on what's in the book. And I never ever will tell the reader what to think, as the author of the book. I mean within the writing of the book, and it's an old George Simenon thing. I'm not judging. I'm trying to understand, and I'm writing my characters from the inside. I'm trying to inhabit their world, and I won't stand in judgment.
But from what you're saying about the way you write as well, if you are saying you didn't know where characters are going, and maybe you're surprised that they take that turn or they become like that, then you genuinely don't know what would have happened next, because you stop just as the reader stops.
No, that's absolutely, and I then reflect on what I've written, and I owe to some extent. I suppose I'm not one for sort of going back over stuff, but it's in a way that's the moment we're at now with this book. The book will come out next week, So at this point, I'm only, of course, I have a couple of friends who read my drafts, not many. I'm not one. And then you have your agent and your publisher and your editor. But you don't know what people are going to make of the book at this point. And it's only once people start asking you questions, or critics might write something, people like yourself, start feeding versions of the book back to you, that you see what the book is doing out in the world. At this point, you don't know. I don't really know how people will react to the characters. I always assume they'll react exactly as I react, but that's not the case. I mean, I remember with Manfred Baumann, and I wrote this character. He's an exaggerated version of myself in some ways, but he's also quite creepy in his some of his actions. But I had only ever been inside Manfred Baumann's head. I never really thought about him, how he might appear to an outsider. And I remember a friend saying, "Oh my God, that Manfred Baumann, he's such a creep." I actually felt really offended. I was like they'd insulted me.
Well, that was kind of where I was hedging my, or being mealy with my words about Collins Braithwaite, because I didn't want to say, well, actually, I think he's a smashing fellow. But
well, I suppose that's, you don't know, people may think Collins Braithwaite is a version of me. Collins Braithwaite, just for the record, is not a version of me. And I felt, he is this sort of monstrous, massively larger than life character, and that's why he was he's just a big lion beast. But I think maybe that's the difference as well between the first novel and the fourth novel. You move away a little bit more from characters. He is an invention. But I hope that I manage somehow to invest him with some. I mean, in his bloody project, the villain is Lachlan Mackenzie. And we know he's the murder victim. We know from the beginning, and we only ever see him from Roddy McRae's point of view. So Lachlan Mackenzie is never invested with any inner life. We don't get any insight into why he might be behaving the way he does. We can speculate about it if we want, but it's not in the book. Because of the constraints placed on the way the book's narrated, which I will never break. Whereas in this book, because we have the view from the other side of the office from the young women, and we have my biographical account. So, I think as I wrote the character, he became more complex to me, and I began to maybe think, maybe this is why he's behaving like this. But that's me reflecting kind of afterwards, and that's for a reader to. I think he's a character who will provoke a strong reaction.
And I'm interested. I think that's right, because he is charismatic, and I think that's a difficult thing to pull off. You understand. You can be abhorred by his actions. You can almost understand where he's coming from and why it is, and then he changes, and there's but again, that's me reading.
Well, that's
I'm on the couch.
Absolutely. I'm totally fascinated.
I've said too much. I've said too much. So when you get responses, start getting responses to the book, are you ever surprised by what people think about it, or does it matter? I guess with his bloody project, which so many people have read and commented on, and I'm sure spoken to you about, has that changed the way you think about the book, or does that never happen? It's just that other people have a different idea.
I think with his bloody project, because it was, I think we can call it a success.
I think we can call it a success.
I think the thing that made me think about the book differently was, when I was abroad, and people, it's incredible to be translated and go to festivals abroad, and people, I went to Korea, I've been to India, I've been to Russia, because of this book, Australia, America, Estonia. I mean, it's I say that because I'm I'm flabbergasted. You know, because you know it's a book about a village in Scotland in 1869, and at no point in the 2.5 years it took me to write it, at no point did I ever think about whether it would be of any interest to anybody outside a village in Scotland.
You didn't think you'd get a world tour out of it.
And then you go and talk to people in Russia, and they find some parallels with it in, you know, Russian serfdom and the feudal system of Russia, or you're in China and somebody talks about the oppressive nature of the Maoist regime, and that you're like, wow, this is incredible. Somehow people find parallels with episodes in their own history with a book you've written, and it doesn't change the book. It just makes me realise that the book absolutely does not belong to me. It goes out into the world, and this is where if I made grand statements saying this is what the book is about, then I feel that wouldn't happen. You'd be closing off the possibilities that people can find in a book, and that's just like been incredible. And it hasn't. Yeah, I mean, obviously that book just, you know, gathered a lot more comment than my other books. Not that, you know, they haven't, they haven't gone completely unnoticed. But it doesn't. I mean, I try very hard not to, you know, when I continue to write, you know, I try very hard not to have these kind of thoughts of what will anybody think, how will this resonate. To be honest, I'm completely capable of not thinking about that. You know, and I think if you start thinking about that, then you're I was about to swear on your nice family podcast.
You used to have an explicit sign, so
you're scuppered as a writer, because I think you're no longer engaged in an authentic process, and that might sound a bit like old school existential, but I am an old existentialist, you know, and I want my process to be authentic, and that means being inside the process and not standing outside the process wondering about what it means or how other people will receive it or react to it. You know, I don't think I can't speak for other writers, but of course I want people to like my work, and you want people to read your work, and it does matter if people. I mean, if there will be some reviews in the papers in the next week or two, and you know, if I get a really bad review, I'm not going to pretend that it won't hurt. It depends what it said. You know, the thing that if a reviewer said this book is badly written, that would really hurt. If they said they didn't like it for some reason, you know, that might be okay. I mean, I think a lot of critics and reviewers are actually really, really smart, and they're not. I think very few reviewers, if any, are out to find fault with books in a malicious way. But it's not to say that your book. I could point to flaws in my book. I'm not going to tell anyone else what I think they are. But yeah, you know, of course you care what people think. You know,
I can imagine you reviewing your own book.
Yeah, well, I think there's plenty of authors who've probably been on Amazon and done it, but yeah, I'd probably make more of a thing.
I'm really critical about it. I can imagine that as well.
One of the, you know, I remember the back cover of my edition of Alistair Gray's Lanark, or is it? No, it's 1982 Janine, which describes it as an already dated novel. I'm like, I mean, even at the time, that was just like. I love Alistair Gray for that, and I love his publisher for allowing that. You know, I mean, that's just so cool. And I don't know if I need to ask Saraband if I can describe my book as being already dated.
I think Banks did something similar with The Wasp Factory. You know, this is the worst book ever written in English. Something great like that.
Which, as his first novel, is quite bold.
Yeah, maybe it was only in the subsequent versions. I'm not sure. I'll have to check that out. But certainly there's something like that. So, I mean, I guess it's too early to see what you're doing next, is it? Is it all about case study at the moment?
Well, I mean, it is in terms of like how my time's been spent. It's a busy time, but you know, the book is written and you have to move on. I mean, you spend a lot of time talking about the book, But you know, my plan is to write the final part of the Gorski trilogy, and I'm kind of itching to get at it. There's been a few little other projects sort of in the last sort of year or so. I did a thing for Radio 4, which was a different kind of challenge. But it took, you know, everything takes me longer than I think. I got the commission with like, can you write 5 parts, about 10,000 words? I was like, no, I'll do it in a month.
Yeah.
I was like, what was I thinking? You know, 3 months later. But you know, it was a challenge, and it was really interesting for me listening to it go out, because when an actor reads your lines, I mean, it wasn't a radio play, it was a story being read out by 2 actors. Of course, there were 2 conflicting accounts, as there always are. And with every line, the actor is engaged in an act of interpretation, using where they put the emphasis. So you're hearing your own sentences interpreted, and that was quite. I thought they did a brilliant job. I mean, I was listening to it going, "Oh, this is really good." I liked it much more when I heard it than when I read it. So that was a good experience, but it, you know, takes you away from the novel writing and. So yeah, that's the next plan.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah,
I look forward to that.
Yeah.
Well, Graeme, thank you so much for taking time to have a chat. It's always a pleasure.
It's been a total pleasure, Alistair. Thank you for having me.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. Cheers.